Hey everyone, Steelers Nation! I hope you're all having a fantastic day filled with peace, health, and great news. Today, there's a preseason matchup against the Green Bay Packers. We have some important updates coming out of Pittsburgh that every Steelers fan needs to know, and they could have a big impact on the team moving forward. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss any breaking Steelers news. Now, let's get straight to today's biggest headlines. Here we go, Steelers. Here we go. The Pittsburgh Steelers are facing a fascinating situation, as one of the biggest questions surrounding the team now involves a decision that has already been made, but whose consequences are becoming much clearer with time. The trade that sent Minkah Fitzpatrick away from Pittsburgh. Fitzpatrick has now opened up about his time with the Steelers, and his comments put a spotlight on how the defense used one of its most versatile players. Fitzpatrick explained that when he arrived in Pittsburgh, he was primarily placed at post safety and half safety. He played well in that role, but over time, he felt he became locked into it. According to Fitzpatrick, the problem was that his greatest strength was his versatility. He believed he could be much more effective when moving around the defense and taking on different responsibilities instead of repeatedly lining up in the same spot. That is where this story becomes especially interesting for Steelers fans. Fitzpatrick said that quarterbacks eventually stopped throwing the ball toward his area because they knew where he was going to be. He was still playing good football, but the splash plays and production began to decline. Instead of constantly affecting the game in different ways, he was often making tackles downfield after plays had already broken open, and that raises a very important question about how Pittsburgh handled one of its best defensive players. Fitzpatrick was originally known for exactly this kind of versatility. He could line up deep, play closer to the line of scrimmage, cover from the slot, and take on different responsibilities depending on what the defense needed. In Pittsburgh, however, he became strongly associated with playing deep safety. The result was a player who could still perform at a high level, but whose full skill set was not always being maximized. Now look at what happened after Fitzpatrick left Pittsburgh. During his season with Miami, he was used in multiple areas of the defense. He played a significant amount of his snaps in the slot, the same general role that Pittsburgh eventually wanted Jaylen Ramsey to fill. Fitzpatrick also played in the box, worked as a safety, took snaps as a dime linebacker, and continued to play free safety. That versatility is exactly what makes the trade so difficult to evaluate from Pittsburgh's perspective. The Steelers did not simply lose a talented safety. They moved on from a player who could have potentially filled several of the roles they later needed. Instead, Pittsburgh acquired Jaylen Ramsey and Jonnu Smith, along with a 2027 7th-round pick, while Miami received Fitzpatrick and a 2027 5th-round pick. And here's the part that really deserves your attention. Fitzpatrick ultimately played the big nickel role in Miami that Pittsburgh acquired Ramsey to play. That does not automatically mean Ramsey cannot succeed in Pittsburgh. In fact, the source makes a very clear point that Ramsey could still become an extremely valuable piece of Patrick Graham's defensive system. The issue is that Fitzpatrick potentially could have played that role too, while also giving Pittsburgh the flexibility to move him back to safety when necessary. That possibility becomes even more significant when you consider the changes Pittsburgh has made defensively. Patrick Graham's defense is described as a multiple front system, one in which players can move around more instead of remaining predictable in the same location. That could be especially important for players with the versatility of Ramsey and the type of defensive backs Pittsburgh has wanted to use in different positions, but the hindsight surrounding Fitzpatrick is difficult to ignore. Last season, Fitzpatrick received the 5th best overall grade among safeties in the NFL, according to PFF, with an overall grade above 81. His run defense and coverage grades were also among the strongest at the position. Ramsey, meanwhile, remained an excellent run defender, but his coverage grade was much lower. There is also an age factor. Fitzpatrick is 2 years younger than Ramsey. Again, that does not mean Ramsey is finished or incapable of being an important player for Pittsburgh. It means that looking backward, there was another option available that could have given the Steelers a younger and more versatile defensive player without making the trade in the first place. And perhaps the biggest frustration for Steelers fans is what happened when Pittsburgh needed versatility at safety. Ramsey was asked to play safety for much of the season, despite having not played that position regularly since college. There were moments when it was clear that he was still adjusting to the position, particularly in coverage. Imagine instead having Fitzpatrick available to start the season season in the big nickel role and then move him back to safety when injuries or circumstances required it. That would have given Pittsburgh another level of flexibility, but there is still a way for the Steelers to make this trade look better. Miami only received one season of Fitzpatrick, and that season came during a year in which the Dolphins struggled badly. Outside of the draft pick swap, Miami did not receive enormous long-term value from the deal. Meanwhile, if Ramsey performs at a high level in Pittsburgh's new defensive system and becomes the player the Steelers believe he can be in the big nickel role, the balance of the trade could still shift. That is what makes this situation so intriguing. Pittsburgh may not have needed to make the trade in the first place, but the Steelers can still get the better outcome if Ramsey becomes a major contributor in Patrick Graham's defense. And now we have another quarterback storyline developing at the same time, with Minnesota naming Kyler Murray its starting quarterback for the upcoming season and moving former top 10 pick J.J. McCarthy to the bench. Speculation has already started about where McCarthy could potentially go if Minnesota becomes willing to move him. Pittsburgh was included among the possible destinations in an article from Yard Barker. The argument is obvious. The Steelers have an aging starter in Aaron Rodgers, and eventually they will need to prepare for the post-Rodgers era. The quarterback room also includes Mason Rudolph, Will Howard, and Drew Allar. But there is a major problem with the idea of trading for McCarthy from Pittsburgh's perspective. The Steelers just invested a third-round pick in Drew Allar. If Pittsburgh traded another draft pick to acquire McCarthy, the organization would effectively be spending additional draft capital on another young quarterback while potentially undermining the investment it just made in Allar. And that is where this quarterback debate becomes much more important for Steelers fans. Is J.J. McCarthy actually a better long-term option than Drew Allar, or would trading for McCarthy simply create another quarterback project when Pittsburgh already has one developing inside its building? The source argues strongly in favor of Allar, pointing to his arm talent and the opportunity he has to develop behind Aaron Rodgers while working within Mike McCarthy and Tom Arth's system. Meanwhile, McCarthy has already had an opportunity to show what he can do at the NFL level. So, Steelers Nation, we now have two major debates. One about whether Pittsburgh should have kept Minkah Fitzpatrick, and one about whether the team should even consider pursuing J.J. McCarthy. But before we move into the next major Steelers storyline, I want to hear directly from you. Looking back at the Fitzpatrick trade, would you have kept Minkah in Pittsburgh and trusted him in a versatile role? Or do you believe Jalen Ramsey can ultimately prove that the Steelers made the right decision? Now let's move to the other major question surrounding the Steelers, because the J.J. McCarthy situation is connected directly to Pittsburgh's long-term plans at quarterback. The idea of McCarthy becoming a potential Steelers target came from the fact that Pittsburgh will eventually have to prepare for life after Aaron Rodgers. The Steelers are currently working with a quarterback room that includes Rodgers, Mason Rudolph, Will Howard, and Drew Allar. But the question is whether Pittsburgh really needs to add another young quarterback right now. Based on the situation presented here, the answer is no. The Steelers already used a third-round selection on Drew Allar, and the entire point of that investment is development. Allar has the opportunity to learn behind Rodgers while working within Mike McCarthy and Tom Arth's offensive system. That gives Pittsburgh time to evaluate what it actually has before spending more draft capital on another quarterback. The argument for McCarthy is understandable. He was a highly drafted quarterback coming out of Michigan, and Pittsburgh is going to need a long-term answer eventually. But the Steelers should not make a move simply because a former top 10 quarterback becomes available. The real question should be whether McCarthy gives Pittsburgh something it does not already have, and that is where the situation becomes complicated. The source argues that Allar has significant upside, particularly because of his arm talent, while McCarthy has already had an opportunity to show what he can become at the professional level. Allar has not yet had that opportunity, which means there is still uncertainty surrounding his development. That uncertainty is actually valuable for Pittsburgh right now. The Steelers can afford to let Allar develop. They can watch him work behind Rodgers, allow him to improve his footwork and learn the offense, and then make a much more informed decision about his future. Trading for McCarthy would mean giving up additional draft capital while simultaneously putting the investment in Allar into question. That is a difficult move to justify. And while that quarterback debate continues, another potential trade idea has started circulating around Pittsburgh involving Broderick Jones. The Washington Commanders suddenly have a major problem at left tackle after Laremy Tunsil suffered a torn triceps injury that is expected to keep him out for the rest of the season. Tunsil is an important part of Washington's offensive line, especially for a team that has major expectations surrounding quarterback Jayden Daniels. That immediately created speculation about whether the Steelers could potentially move Jones to Washington. On paper, the idea makes sense. Pittsburgh has depth at tackle, and Jones is a former first-round pick. If Washington needed an immediate solution at left tackle, the Steelers could theoretically have another player capable of filling the swing tackle role behind their starters. But there are reasons why this trade may not be particularly realistic. The biggest issue is Jones's current physical situation. According to the information in the source, Jones is still working toward his playing weight after being unable to lift during his rehabilitation from the serious neck injury he suffered last season. He remains undersized at this point and is still trying to add the necessary weight to return to football action. That is something Washington would obviously have to evaluate before giving up draft capital. There is also the fact that the Commanders already have another option in Brandon Coleman, a former third-round pick out of TCU. Washington previously reached the conference championship game with Coleman starting at left tackle, so the organization has reason to believe he can handle the position. Washington also has Chris Paul, who started at left guard last season and played good football, giving the Commanders another potential option for adjusting their offensive line. Because of that,